wonderful to see so many of you this evening. Welcome to Royal Holloway. Welcome back to Royal Holloway on behalf of the Classics Department. We're delighted to see you all. Thank you to all the alumni who have made it back despite the weather. Welcome back home. Thank you to colleagues from other schools who are honoring us by their presence. Thank you to colleagues from the School of Humanities. It's wonderful to be part of this wonderful community of scholars. It feels, the School of Humanities, as Juliana said earlier, feels like an intellectual community where ideas thrive, and we enjoy being part of it. So I don't want to take too much time. I want us to think a little bit for a few minutes about the person after whom this lecture is named, Miss Dabis. You may have wondered who she was and what we know about her. So I had to do a little bit of digging into the archives. Not only the archives of Royal Holloway, but also Newnham College, Cambridge. Okay. So this is Miss Dabis. Miss Dabis, according to her obituary by Eleanor Sidgwick, Nick will know more about the Sidgwicks and may want to tell you more. She was principal of Newnham College, Cambridge, I believe the second principal, and she wrote the obituary of Miss Dabis in 1906. So she was born, Dabis was born on the island of Rügen in northeastern Germany in 1853. She lost both her parents and was raised by an aunt and an uncle. And after training as a teacher, she came to this country to work with a family as a governess. Then went back to Germany very briefly and came back to Cambridge, to Newnham College, to study classics. Apparently, according to Miss Sidgwick, she didn't know Latin until a couple of weeks before the start of the course, no Greek, and very limited maths. And despite that, she thrived and achieved a creditable 2-2. Well, in those days, 2-2 was quite an achievement. After Newnham, she became a classics teacher at Manchester High School for Girls, and then came down to Royal Holloway a few years after its opening as a lecturer in classics, the very first classics lecturer. A few years later, in 1895, she published a paper entitled "The Position of Women in the English University." Well, I wish I could find that, but I couldn't. I tried, but it's nowhere to be found. At least I was unsuccessful. Matilda Bishop, the first principal of Royal Holloway, and remember that it started off as a women's-only college, said the following about Dabis. Everything that went on in college, social or academic, and this is Miss Dabis in her study in Founders, and look at that. This is beautiful, isn't it? Everything that went on in college, social or academic, enlisted her hearty sympathy and, wherever possible, her active cooperation. Outside the lecture room, she spent herself in the service of the college. She was a true scholar, a great teacher. Her unique personality and her high standard of duty in work and in her relations with her pupils and the college generally, combined with the loving sympathy which she gave to all who needed it, made her a force in the lives of a large number of students. She was described by another Royal Holloway contemporary as the humanest of all those who expound the humanities. The humanist. And it is also said that she donated a large number of classics texts to the library. Sadly, chronic illness forced her to give up her job in 1899. She returned to Germany, where she passed away in 1906 in Bonn. 117 years after her death, we honor her memory and celebrate her contribution to our discipline. As well as to the life of Royal Holloway. I can say with confidence that the values she embraced and embodied still inspire Dabis' successors in the classics department. I believe that these values can inspire all of us who serve as teachers of the humanities. The pursuit of research, the committed scholarship, passionate teaching, and last but not least, empathy, or as the obituary put it, loving sympathy that can impact student lives. Tonight's event is an opportunity for us all to come together as a community and reflect on a topical theme from the vantage point of the ancient world. Two distinguished scholars, Professors Rubinstein and Isayev, will give us, I'm sure, plenty to think about and to discuss after the lecture over drinks. Professor Rubinstein needs no introduction. She's a professor of ancient history here at Royal Holloway. She came to Royal Holloway in 1996 or 7, Lena? 5. I got that wrong. She always corrects me. She's a word-leading. I'll try to keep it. I know she's modest and she doesn't want others to blow her trumpet either. But I can say that she's a world-leading legal historian of ancient Greece and an expert on ancient Greek oratory. However, what has always distinguished her work, I believe, is her ability, and I think that she brings that into her teaching. I remember that from teaching observations, is her ability to bring insights from the ancient world to shed light on contemporary problems and to draw parallels from the ancient world to shed light on contemporary issues and problems, social problems or legal issues. Tonight she's speaking on the theme of displacement in the ancient world. And after her talk, Professor Isayev is going to give a response, about 10 to 15 minutes, a short talk and some remarks on Lena's paper. Professor Isayev is another distinguished professor of ancient history. We're really grateful that, A, you accepted our invitation, and you managed to get here despite all odds. She faced a family emergency and she had to rush back to Canada. And until a couple of days ago, it was uncertain whether she'd make it, but she was really keen to be here with us all. So we're really grateful. A few words on her work. Her research examines questions of migration, belonging, displacement, encounter, politics of exception, and constructions of place. She works equally comfortably with history, ancient historical sources, and archaeological material. She's a professor of ancient history and place at the University of Exeter. May I invite you to welcome our two speakers with a round of applause.
Thank you so much, Chris, for your introduction, which, as usual, you make me blush and feel really embarrassed. But I hope I'll get over it. And I hope that this paper will be a reasonable substitute for what we had originally been looking forward for, and I'm absolutely delighted and very grateful to Lena that she was able to get here after all, and I look forward to a discussion. So the themes that we're both working on is displacement, refugees, and in my own case, also genocide. I'm an associate researcher at the Royal Holloway Institute, Holocaust Research Institute, and this, of course, has also then influenced the kind of work that I'm doing at the moment. So I will try to do a bit of what Chris said that I might do, which is to make some connections between the past and the present. And I'm starting with a fascinating Swedish documentary from 2015, which is called Every Face Has a Name. This title, as I say, was borrowed from the documentary itself, and the documentary film is based on 8mm home video or home movie recordings on a single day in Sweden, in Malmö, on the 28th of April, 1945. The footage records the arrival on that April day of 1,948 persons liberated from concentration camps in Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. In 2015, Gerten's aim, that's the name of the producer, was to identify and track down as many of these people as possible, to make them watch the recordings, and to tell their own stories and the stories of other persons whom they recognized in the moving pictures. As each survivor recognized him or herself and put names to other faces, the 1,948 arrivals were transformed from being just a number, an anonymous crowd of mainly women and children, into 1,948 individuals. Each arrived with their own past, with their own personal relationships, and with their own experience of displacement, suffering, and loss. From a European vantage point, nearly 80 years later, the focus on the stories of individual men, women, and children as victims of war, persecution, and displacement may also help us grasp the scale of suffering before and during the Second World War, as well as during the rest of the 1940s, and the displacement of millions and millions of survivors amongst the ruins of Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, the Balkans, and Central Europe, including 12 million displaced Germans. Yet once we think in terms of individuals rather than abstract numbers, comprehending the scale can feel almost as difficult as comprehending mathematical infinity. The words "never again" have echoed down the decades after the Second World War, even as the scale of displacement has increased and the suffering intensified across the globe, including on the Indian subcontinent, in Afghanistan, the Middle East, North Africa, the Sahel, Central and Southern Africa, and the Americas. As for Europe, the crimes against humanity perpetrated in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s and the concomitant internal and external displacement provided further tangible proof of the impotence of the international community generally and of the European nations in particular, first to preempt the conflict and subsequently to prevent it from turning into a tragedy. Since February 2022, Ukraine has turned into a theatre of war and destruction on a scale comparable to what was inflicted on its inhabitants during the Second World War. This is women refugees from Ukraine taken on the 8th of March 2022 in the Warsaw Central Railway Station. The preparedness of other European countries to admit displaced Ukrainian women, children, and elderly men offers a glimmer of hope that there might be a desire to learn from the past in order to mitigate human suffering in the present. But it's also evident that the welcome is motivated by strategic considerations and not just by humanitarian concerns. What is more, questions are increasingly being asked as to how long this policy will prove sustainable and how it might have to be adapted and modified in the event that the Ukrainians lose the war. The war in Ukraine has led not only to further displacement within Europe itself, but it has also exacerbated the suffering and displacement in regions that depend heavily on imported grain, vegetable oil, and fertilizers. I don't know what's happened to this slide. There was actually a proper graph on it, but something has gone wrong clearly when the PowerPoint was transferred. I don't know, Chris. Nope. Yeah, sorry, we'll just skip it. It doesn't matter. It was a pie chart with basically, yeah, and it was a picture. It's disappeared. Okay, that's okay. What? What was that? Oh dear. Right. This is technology when it's worst. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at that. Over the coming years, there's every reason to expect the number of displaced persons to increase dramatically as a result of intensifying conflicts, exacerbated by natural disasters and extreme weather events as a result of climate change. The growing problems relating to sustainability in the conflict zones themselves, as well as in the neighbouring and more distant regions where the millions of displaced will inevitably turn for refuge, are problems which my generation is bequeathing to our children and grandchildren. Again, the magnitude of the challenge that we're all facing becomes dizzying once we bear it in mind that these millions are made up of children, women and men, each of whom has a face, a name and a personal history. So these are the nameless children in a crowd in a cage on the US southern border. Each of these is an individual with a story, a face and a name. Bearing this in mind is imperative if we are to have any hope of inoculating ourselves against the rhetoric of dehumanization and of resisting it actively when we encounter it in the public debate. Given the scale of these problems and the state of the world that we live in, it is an obvious question which I ask myself every day: what point is there in studying ancient history, in investing time in carrying out research in this area? I wish that the answer was that the classical Greeks might provide us with a model for imitation or emulation. But sadly, I don't think that this is the case. To be sure, it's often asserted in modern scholarship that most Greek communities in general, and classical Athens in particular, operated with open borders in peacetime and welcomed immigrants who wished to settle in their midst. Sorry, I don't know what's happened to these PowerPoints, but anyway, let's hope it all works out. You can see the text, I hope. Whether they had come voluntarily as economic migrants or as refugees fleeing war, persecution, or natural disasters. It is often pointed out that at least the Athenians took pride in their record, stretching back to their mythical past of having offered compassion, shelter, and protection to men, women, and children who were fleeing persecution. This is articulated, for example, in the funeral oration by the speechwriter Lysias, purportedly for delivery at a state funeral for Athens' war dead, this text, early in the 4th century BCE. But there is a much darker side to the classical Greek world. It was a world made up from more than 1,000 microstates. Most of them were centered on a single conurbation, surrounded by a territory with defined boundaries. Some of them were landlocked, while others were situated on the coast of the Black Sea, Asia Minor, Sicily, Italy, and the southern coast of what is now France. Warfare between these microstates was endemic. Neither a shared language nor the sharing of important religious rituals and practice appear to have inhibited the kind of behavior that would now be designated as war crimes or even genocide. The Greek world was a world where the enslavement and commodification of human beings was legal, and where it was a regular occurrence that Greeks enslaved other Greeks, especially in the context of war. Each of the more than 1,000 microstates had its own laws and legal system, but to my knowledge, we do not know a single one that banned the practice outright, although some states appear to have outlawed kidnapping and enslavement of free persons within their own territory. What is perhaps more shocking, contemporary Greeks observers only very rarely condemn the kind of genocide as a matter of principle, although several writers include graphic and emotionally charged descriptions of individual instances, as is the case with this passage on the screen here. The practice seems to have been tragically commonplace as a component of Greek warfare. In a research project I was involved in some years ago, we identified 49 communities that in the 5th and 4th centuries alone had been subjected either to outright anthropodismos, the Greek name that reflect the kind of action that I would call genocide, or which had capitulated to an enemy on condition that all free inhabitants would depart from their city, leaving behind their homes and their belongings, except for a few items of clothing, typically a cloak or two per person, and a small sum of pocket money. On this slide, I have marked in black those communities that experienced genocide. Those subjected to mass expulsion of the entire population have been highlighted in blue. I must stress that this list only includes data from the 5th and 4th centuries, and that it does not include communities that were destroyed in connection with the Persian invasions. The vast majority are Greek communities destroyed by other Greeks, Greeks who spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, and shared the same or very similar cultural practices. In the first book of his history, Thucydides comments on the ubiquity of the practice during the 27 years of war that he describes on this slide. His observation that similar suffering was bound to recur again and again in the future is sadly borne out by the evidence for the 4th century. And then there are a few communities which I highlighted on the previous screen in red, and I don't know how to go back now on this slide, so I hope you can still remember that there was some signal in red. We'll come back to that. These are communities which we know had experienced genocide, anthropodismos, or mass expulsion on more than one occasion. This is important, as is also the fact that many of the communities marked in green or black reappear in our record, often a few decades after their destruction. In some instances, we can't rule out that a community had been resettled by a different population, as Thucydides remarks. Nevertheless, in most cases, there's reason to believe that we are observing examples of a remarkable level of resilience, with displaced survivors of genocide or expulsion, or their children or grandchildren returning to the site that used to be their home and rebuilding their community. Until recently, modern research on exile and displacement in the classical Greek world has tended to focus primarily on adult men of military age, whose main objective was to secure their return. There's plenty of evidence for displaced men forming temporary political communities during their exile, establishing diplomatic contacts with cities that might help them in their endeavor. Where possible, they joined in military ventures organized by states or alliances that had a strategic interest in facilitating their return. And there again, just bear in mind what is happening now in Ukraine. The world of classical and Hellenistic Greek historiography is very much a man's world. Active combat and political decision-making within and between Greek communities tend to occupy a central place in the accounts. On the whole, the plight of women, children, and the elderly of both genders receives far less attention. Yet, it is important to be aware that in terms of demographic profile, the communities of displaced Greeks very likely varied considerably, depending on the circumstances that had led to their displacement. It was extremely common for Greek communities to drive political dissidents into exile, sometimes in the hundreds or even thousands. There is evidence that many such exiles took their wives, children, and mothers and sisters with them, such as the first-hand account here on the screen of a displaced citizen from the island of Sifnos who decided to take his mother and teenage sister with him. But there's also evidence for exiles who deemed it safer to leave their dependents behind, as internally displaced or in the care of members of their extended families. Life in exile was risky, even for adult men of military age. Women and children were even more exposed because of the risk of enslavement that I mentioned earlier. This risk was especially acute if they became separated from adult male members of their kin group. So when facing exile, an adult man would have to make a very difficult assessment of the risks that they would face if left behind, and the risk associated with their displacement. Could somebody stop the notification of this? Is it the email somehow? Sorry, it's distracting. I don't know what to do.
Nothing.
Right. Moreover,
Sorry about that.
okay. Moreover, we have many examples of communities that took measures to evacuate women and children during the early stages of a war, leaving behind only men of military age. And again, I remind you of what's going on now in Ukraine. Doris Sigelis provides a graphic description of what such an evacuation would have looked like in its description of how the civilian population of Akragas in Sicily was evacuated to safety in Gela, about 44 miles away. We don't have the kind of documentary evidence that may form the basis of reliable statistics, but the demographic data relating to German refugees arriving in Denmark in 1945, Syrian refugees in 2020, and Ukrainian evacuees in 2023 may suggest that the representation of women and children could often have been at least as high as, and probably considerably higher than, a normal population in peacetime. Crucially, it was on the survival and safety of citizen women and children that the longer-term resilience of the community depended, and which allowed the displaced community to keep alive their hope of eventually returning to the city that they had lost. As mentioned earlier, the fates of displaced women and children are not among the main preoccupations of ancient Greek historiographers. There are attestations of their presence in the corpus of Athenian law court speeches and in some of the speeches written for delivery in political decision-making bodies. But unfortunately, our material is heavily skewed towards Athens and therefore extremely patchy when it comes to the other 1,000+ Greek communities. Even for Athens, it is difficult to be certain about the numbers of refugees who are residing in the city at any one time. It makes our task all the harder that most of our Athenian sources don't distinguish clearly between those who had arrived in the city as refugees and those who had settled in Athens of their own free will and who were free to return home whenever they wanted. But it is frequently possible to complement the information relating to 4th century anthropolismos, genocide, expulsion and evacuation, with precious documentation for the presence in Athens of women and children from the affected communities in the form of tombstones and dedicatory inscriptions in Athenian sanctuaries. During the 4th century, it became a widespread practice to inscribe funerary monuments with the full name of the deceased, that of his father, his or her first name, the name of his or her father, and for an Athenian citizen, the deme, parish that they belong to, and for free non-citizens, their community of origin. Male non-citizens are represented from communities across the Greek world. By contrast, non-citizen women commemorated in the Athenian 4th century record are overwhelmingly from precisely those communities which we know had been subjected to destruction and displacement. 3 communities are particularly well represented when it comes to the commemoration of women and children. One is the community of Plataea, the other that of Plataea's arch-enemy, Thebes, both located in the region directly north of Athenian territory. And the third city is that of Olynthos in northern Greece, which was completely destroyed by Philip II of Macedonia in 348 BCE. Among the stones commemorating displaced women and children are some which display highly unusual features, including some examples of tombstones which identified children by metronymics, i.e. their mother's names, rather than the conventional way of identifying by father's name. Another moving example is this tombstone for Plangone, the daughter of Ptolemaides of Plataea, who evidently died in childbirth. Her baby boy is identified as Ptolemaides of Plataea, named after Plangone's own father. It's striking that the father of the little boy is not named at all, and nor are the grieving persons surrounding by the dying woman. It is very likely, of course, that they were members of her kin group, displaced along with her when their community was destroyed or displaced for the second time in less than 60 years. But another possibility is that they belonged to an Athenian household who had agreed to provide shelter to Plangone and perhaps also other women and children from her devastated community. This is not as far-fetched as it might perhaps sound. On slide 10, we heard about the tragic story of a family who'd fled from Sifnos and who had at first been staying with guest friends in the island community of Milos nearby before moving on later. This is not the only example of Greek refugees who were housed in the private homes of citizens in the community to which they had turned for protection. A fragment of an Athenian law court speech delivered by an Athenian citizen in support of a non-citizen in court relates how a Theban citizen, Kephisodoros, had opened his home to the Athenians who were fleeing persecution by the junta, commonly referred to as the 30 tyrants, who were exercising a relatively short-lived reign of terror at the very end of the 5th century. When a similarly brutal regime was installed in Thebes 2 decades later, and its citizens driven into exile in large numbers, the speaker reciprocated by opening his family home to the son of his Theban host. There's also evidence for evacuated women and children being placed in the homes of guest friends in other Greek cities in anticipation of an armed conflict or a similar kind of emergency. The reliance on personal connections or the generosity of strangers willing to open their homes to refugees has recently acquired a contemporary relevance in connection with the evacuation of civilians from Ukraine and from other conflict zones. It is also one that I remember from my own childhood, when more than 3,000 refugees fled persecution in Poland in 1968 and arrived in small boats in Denmark, where they were initially housed in private homes, including the home of my parents. But as a long-term measure, the reliance of private generosity and personal connections is unlikely to be sustainable on its own. That is clearly the case now, and it very likely was the case also in ancient Greece, particularly if large numbers of displaced persons sought protection and shelter in a community that was itself under pressure because of the conflict. As I mentioned at the beginning of my paper, it was for a long time a widespread view that individual Greek communities did not attempt to control their borders, and they were not particularly worried about immigrants or immigration. It is still also rather commonplace to find attempts to estimate the number of free non-citizens resident in Athens, an estimate that takes it for granted, A, that the majority of these residents were male, and B, that the number remained stable over the 8 decades that separated the end of the Peloponnesian War at the very end of the 5th century BCE and Athens' subjection to Macedonian rule in 322 BCE. But if we bear it in mind that the overwhelming numbers of men, women, and children displaced by war in the world that surrounds us now, and if we bear in mind that the communities close to the zone of conflict are often themselves at breaking point when confronted with a large number of persons who require food and roof over their heads, there are compelling reasons for questioning conventional interpretations of the Greek material and the implicit assumptions that they used to be based on. At the very least, it's important to remember that the literary sources that tend to focus overwhelmingly on displaced adult men can easily lead us to underestimate the challenges presented by the sudden arrival in a small community, say of the size of Egham, because that's what we're talking about, of a displaced population in the hundreds or even thousands from a neighboring community. This raises questions of sustainability from the point of view of the recipient community, that in terms of their quality are not all that different from the challenges we face today, although there are, of course, significant differences in terms of quantity. So how did Greek communities cope with displacement caused by conflict, especially if circumstances did not permit the refugees to return home for several decades or even several generations? And this is where, when confronting this question, that we again come face to face with the darker side of classical Greece. Many communities did, in fact, attempt to control immigration, operating with what is in many ways similar to a brutal points-based system. In 4th century Athens, there were 2 requirements that an immigrant had to meet in order for him or her to be legally resident in the community. They had to find a personal sponsor among the citizens, and they had to pay a monthly tax, 1 drachma per month for a man and half a drachma per month for a woman, unless she was accompanied specifically by a husband or an adult son. Now, 1 drachma per month may not sound like a huge amount. 1 drachma was probably the equivalent of a day's wages for a skilled laborer. But for a displaced person who had been deprived of all his or her earthly possessions, this could still be significant, and all the more so if a man was accompanied, as we saw it previously, by several female members of his household, of his extended family. Failure to meet these requirements meant that the illegal immigrant was subject not to deportation, but actually even worse, subject to being sold as a slave at a public auction. Records of immigration tax were kept by the contractors who operated concessions to collect it, private-public partnerships, and there were incentives provided to citizens and non-citizens alike to denounce any person who resided in the community without a personal sponsor. That too may actually start to sound worryingly familiar. These are probably important reasons why the existence of displaced Greeks is often described in our sources as one of wandering, of moving from community to community without any prospect of settling anywhere in the longer term, and with family groups forced to separate from each other. This is described harrowingly in a speech given by an Athenian speechwriter, Isocrates, to a Plataean displaced exile. So he's displaced by the destruction of his community in 373, addressing the Athenian assembly with a plea for admission of himself and all his fellow citizens. And this is the passage that I put on the screen. And then there's another way that we might explain at least some of the attempts by Greek states to create the kind of resilience that would allow them to extend some welcome, at least, to displaced people who turned up at the doorstep. Those two measures are very often being represented in modern secondary literature as effectively discriminatory. One was that only citizens were given the right to acquire housing and land. And on the face of it, yes, it sounds like discrimination. But if you look at it from the poorer part of the population, what does this mean? It means that you try to keep the cost of real estate at least under some control. If you have too many people coming in and actually starting to line up to buy the property, you may end up with a situation similar to that in central London or comparable to it. The other one about the intermarriage, again, this has very often been interpreted as a kind of racist measure, but actually we know that the Greeks went about this in very different ways, and the Athenians themselves did not actually introduce this measure until the middle of the 5th century, where I suspect that following a massive Athenian defeat, a lot of pro-Athenians from other states displaced because of revolutions turned up knocking at the door of Athens and basically asking to be let in. In the 4th century, we have 2 tightenings of that rule, in fact 3 if you count the aftermath of an Athenian civil war, where the Athenians tightened it further at the very point where we know that there was serious disturbance and destruction in the regions neighboring Athens, from which especially women and children were likely to come, and where we actually have some tombstones to suggest that this was the case. Now, if you don't control intermarriage, what happens? Well, one thing that may happen is that there's competition for young men. There are too many girls, and what happens then is that men will have to offer greater and greater dowries in order to afford for their daughters to get married. And being unmarried is, of course, a disaster, whether you are male or female. So, in a sense, you could say that this kind of measure might be interpreted as a way of shielding the Athenian poorest part of the population against a kind of inflation that might actually drive them into destitution. And then there's a third one, which again echoes in a sense in what is happening in the world around us today, which is subsidized grain imported, stimulating increased importation of grain, and then subsidizing certain quantities for citizens to buy at reduced prices. Again, this may be one of the ways that the poorer part of the population could be kept on board rather than turning into a refusal stand and basically asking for the refugees to be turned away. 4, it is very important to note that in many Greek communities, the ordinary citizens, no matter how wealthy or how poor, as long as they were male and over 18, had a direct say in the shaping of policies in their communities. And decisions to extend special welcomes and concessions to refugees was actually made in a process that reminds us of a modern referendum. It is not detached politicians higher up who are making that decision, it is ordinary people. And when we are confronted with decisions, again in our epigraphical record, of welcoming refugees, we have to say this is a majority decision. We have to take it seriously. It is a question of attitude and motivation. Now, no doubt there were strategic, self-interested reasons for helping people, especially if the displaced population was a state that you were fighting a war together with in a coalition. What is more, if you are fighting together with troops contributed from several states in an alliance, these people were likely during their campaign to form those personal relations that might make it easier for you to find a citizen sponsor. But there's also another consideration, and that is that if you yourself have experienced displacement, and the Athenians had, along with all the other Greeks at least that I showed on the previous slide, you might actually be more open in your heart in terms of extending compassion and a welcome to people who were in need in a way that you might yourself expect to be further down the line, or which you and your family had experienced at a previous point in time. So the last slide has disappeared. That was actually a quotation from Aristotle's Rhetoric on compassion, and where he points out that if you are extremely well off and if you think that disasters won't befall you because you are fortunate, then you are likely to be less inclined to show compassion to people in need. But if you have yourself or your family experience of that kind of thing, of that kind of situation, you may actually be more likely not to turn away when people stretch out a hand and ask you for help. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Lene. It's going to be a very hard act to follow. And also I just want to say I'm just really grateful Lene stepped in only last week and very kindly and generously accepted the plan B that we had in case I couldn't know soon enough whether I'd be able to return. And obviously very much many thanks to Richard and to Christos and for the Dabis Foundation, as we saw earlier, for thinking of me in the first place. It's a real honor to be here, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you and the alumni and to see some faces that I recognize in the audience. As Christos has mentioned, it's been a difficult time, but I also realize how precious my own position is in holding the right kind of passports. The right kind of passports that allow me to go immediately to Canada and then be also able to return in a short time to be here with you today and to listen to Lene's fantastic lecture and be able to respond to it. So the discussion about which we're gonna have and which Lene just presented on is people who are not in those kind of positions, and many of those remain today. And their position is much more difficult historically, and especially at this very moment in the UK, when the current government attempts to pass what is an illegal immigration bill. I don't know if any of you are aware of that, but it's been very concerning, not only because of its illegality according to the UK law, but because it goes against the human rights conventions. And also because a slightly different thing, it kind of ignores the interconnected world that we live in. So the bill that really tries to prevent specifically people coming by boat is a kind of arrogance. The arrogance that, first of all, people in this country would always be welcome. And this is a little bit, Lene, what you finished on. You know, that we would somehow always be welcome somewhere because we come from the right place. But also that we will never need to be welcomed by anyone because we're always all right. So we'll be okay. It's everyone else that's in trouble. But that, of course, shows a real kind of memory loss from Europe, which, again, Lene started off with, in that during that time, people didn't just seek asylum, refuge in places in Europe, in America, in Australia, but many of them, when Europe didn't open its doors, went to the Middle East, they went to India, they went to Africa, exactly the places where people are coming from now. And I was really interested, Lene, what you said at the very end, which was about, you know, if you yourself experience something, you'll have more compassion. But what is also interesting, and the statistics show, and I don't have the details for this because I just thought of it as you presented, is that second-generation people of those very same refugees or immigrants are less likely to welcome. So it's completely strange, and I haven't gone into researching what happens there, but I think that would be really interesting to understand why that is. And that might explain a few things, perhaps, about personal experience and how that affects also policy. So what I want to do is, in my response, first reflect a bit more on Lene's contribution and the themes of her lecture, and especially people who are making difficult decisions and leaving home, and that moment of departure in the context of war, and also that in the ancient world. And then I'm going to very briefly give you a little bit of an insight into the kind of things I would have talked about, which fits very nicely into that space between the departure and the arrival, and which is where very much of my current research is based. So I'm kind of going to start with first responding to some of the things that you were saying. And some of them are questions, some of them are a bit comments. One of the things that I'm going to very much connect with is the strategic consideration. So the fact that you start off by saying, actually, it's not about just the humanitarian help. And I would say it's very rarely about the humanitarian help. Even the decision that was made in Germany in 2015 has its own very difficult and complex history about why that decision was made to take in so many refugees in that year. What people don't often realize, in that same year, they took in, I think it was about 100,000 refugees. That very same year, a larger number of people migrated from America to Germany. And in that very same year, something like 40,000 people who were coming in from some of these areas where there was war left Germany. So it makes it really problematic, or rather what Lene was saying, it's who is the one who's being accepted is very important. And Ukraine has really, really showcased this very, very highly. I was in Germany last year working in Potsdam to think about migration a lot with colleagues and students, and that was very, very present about the treatment of Ukrainian women and children who were coming in, also Russian refugees who didn't want to be part of the wars, and the difference between Middle Eastern refugees who were coming in, most of whom were young men of a certain age. Not just, but that's what the media presents it as, and how they were taken as very different kinds of groups of people. Yeah. So that's just that kind of strategic consideration as I'm going to focus on a little bit in what I'm going to say. Then Lene mentioned this kind of magnitude in millions and the scale of it. And this is also something that I really spend a lot of time thinking about. As we get to a certain point of a scale where we wonder, well, how exceptional is it? So this is always presented, we're in a moment of crisis. This is completely exceptional. This does not happen. All of a sudden it's happened now. It's part of the current kind of second millennium condition. But actually, first of all, people in the tens and hundreds of thousands live in contexts of almost permanent temporariness, or have done since the nation-state's been created, especially from about the mid-20th century. So you have to start asking, if they're not exceptional, do we have to stop treating these contexts as exceptional and recognize that the size of the UK, a population the size of the UK, is living in contexts of displacement? So that is a lot of talent, a lot of people who cannot express themselves, who not allowed to be part of communities, and use that energy, joy, and talent the way they would like and the way that international community could very much benefit from. So what do we do if we don't exceptionalize? And I don't know if you've heard of Agamben. He's somebody who talked about the state of exception in refugee camps and was very, very, very well, inspiring to think with about 20 or so years ago. But now that state of exception has really been challenged. And people like Sasson have said, well, are we instead talking about the systemic edge? And what he means by that is, are people who are in these contexts actually represent the edge of what is the norm and part of our society? Right? So they're suggesting there's something wrong within the communities we live with that allow a lot of these people to be in these kind of conditions. So that's just something that's really inspired from what you were saying, Lene. Another question of why ancient history. I'll come back to that a little bit in the kind of 5-10 minute talk that I do about my own bit, but that is just so important. I mean, I've had, and it is a privilege, the ultimate privilege of kind of being the ancient, kind of pocket ancient historian in a lot of contexts where like complicated things are said, but oh, we know somebody who works on this. Yeah, let's get Lena to come and tell us what the ancients say. And that's really introduced me to different ways of thinking, including in refugee camps. And I kind of said to them, I mean, I get a lot out of this. You know, it's really powerful for me to be here and listen to all of you and understand and try to understand different contexts. Well, I don't understand, you know, can you tell me what is it that you would like to hear, what you'd like to get out? And they said, well, the world that you talk about expands the imagination of the possible. Because we sometimes get stuck into thinking that this is how things must have always been. People would have always not wanted foreigners and outsiders to come. That's obvious. There would have always been boundaries, so Lene mentioned boundaries. But the nature of those boundaries is very different. And the physical presence of us being able to get through those boundaries is also very different. Yeah? And to try and understand that and to really explode what we think of as the norm today and has been through time is really important. And ancient history provides that possibility. There are different ways of creating communities, of being communities, but also recognizing that the kind of violences, Lene, that you talked about, and you nicely kind of tied them, well, this makes me think of today. What is it? Are those violences perpetual? Are they different? Where are the openings and opportunities to do something different? It's not about learning from history. I'm afraid I don't believe in that. I think history has no lessons in that way. But what history does is forces us to rethink where we are and also makes us recognize that where we are is in a continuum and where do we sit. So if we think about waves of in and out, that's what gives hope, that there are waves. So we might feel that we're in a drop now, but maybe we're coming up. And I've talked to a lot of young people in the last year again. I've been very privileged to be able to visit some, unfortunately, not very good contexts. And I talked to the young people there in conflict situations, and I was really inspired by how we, the adults, calling myself one of these, seem to have messed up their world, whether it's sustainability in the environment or anything else. They seem incredibly positive. We can get over this, we can find ways, and look, we've done this. And look how this connects. And they're talking to each other. And that gives us all, I think, a lot of hope and inspiration. Okay, so in terms of why ancient history, I think it's incredibly important, all periods of history and the humanities in particular. It's about how we articulate what we do as humanities scholars that I think is so important, and also to government. I want to just touch also on your point about evacuation of women and children. And this kind of place of women. So women appear in contexts of displacement in different ways, and we can start with Helen. I mean, Helen is displaced, right? And she's in a context of women who are about to also be displaced. And I haven't done enough research, and Lene, your articles about women in displacement are some of the main things I read when I think about these things. And I really want to understand more about whether women can tell us about community in general, because their position is quite different, especially in terms of their rights, protection, and belonging, especially when there's intermarriage. So they are almost having to confront these things in a way that maybe men don't in such a constant way. And that will allow us to think about this in a different way. Also, I spent time thinking about women and children when I was working on migration, and particularly I was interested in the families of mercenaries. We don't really think of them as people in displacement, or we don't even know very much about what happened to the families of mercenaries. But there's enough evidence to suggest they took them with them, and they left them somewhere safer until they did their war and then came back. And we partly know this from treaties with the employers of mercenaries, that if they died, those employers would provide a certain kind of some kind of almost monetary or support or protection fund to the families wherever they might be. So it gives us a sense that families came with. Sometimes they're referred to as baggage in context of the ancient text. So the mercenaries were allowed to go pick up their baggage, and that term could involve the women and the children. So again, these women and children, how different are their relationships with the communities they're in? Sometimes they're living there for 10 years. I mean, the mercenaries who fought in Italy, the Carthaginian mercenaries, then came back after 10 years to pick up their baggage. What happened to them there? How did they interact? You know, and what happens to the women living here at the moment, who are Ukrainian women and children, who've now been here, you know, well over a year? So they're making new relationships. They're thinking about things. They're having to work. And how does that then connect the communities, but also what does it mean about the way they connect to their men, their families back home? So I think there's so much to do. And perhaps not surprisingly, it's the women and children who are displayed in particular ways in our ancient texts, because it's primarily they that are almost allowed to seek refuge, in a way I think that perhaps some men are not. So the Platean case is particularly interesting because we just don't have very many there. So the Platean case says we want our whole population to be given refuge in Athens, and that's happened already once. And the question there is, are we talking about primarily elite? Are we talking about the whole community? And it would be really interesting to know more of that. And I'm just going to mention a couple more points in relation to Lene's presentation. This kind of private generosity, long-term sustainability, that is really interesting. A colleague has written a wonderful paper about Afghan refugees who are currently in Iran, about how, because they're not allowed to become full citizens and haven't been able to for decades, the Iranians at times see them as challenging the hospitable nature of the Iranian people. It's like because they are still there, they're making it look like Iranian people are not hospitable, where in fact they've allowed all these people to come in. So there's an interesting thing there, as you say. It has a time scale. And what does it mean when, actually extends more than a few months and it's no longer an emergency? What happens there? And that becomes a question of whose responsibility is it to look after people who are displaced. And that will differ in every single context, and also about who is able to find friends and family and who not. And I guess the final thing I will say is about the kind of illegal immigrant that you mentioned, Lene, and the wandering side of it. That's why people wander. I mean, what I wonder is, although, yes, absolutely, that there's ways that people who are displaced are used by communities, and that's one of the things I'm going to talk about next. But also, what's interesting is, maybe I'm mistaken in this, and I'd love to hear more, but we don't seem to hear, at least politically, at least not in the sources that remain, that people who are displaced are used as a tool. In other words, that the population has said, we will stop refugees from coming in the way we hear about it today. I mean, perhaps I'm wrong about that, or I've missed something, but we don't really hear it writ large. So you might hear about it in terms of the referendum, Lene, that you're mentioning, and again, the case I start with, although not historic but mythical, is very much to do with that. But I'm just wondering if there's something that's changed. So the hospitality is trumpeted. See, we are very hospitable, Athens says. Whether they actually were any more or less hospitable than anyone else is very questionable. But it's not very much about keeping immigrants out as a sign of power for their own authorities. So I'm going to leave that there to Lene, maybe just to ponder, and all of you to ponder, maybe help you also to come up with some questions afterwards. And just move maybe for another 7 minutes or so if I can. Is that all right? Thanks. Just to talk a little bit about how a lot of these things that Lene's just discussed very wonderfully connect to some of the things I've been thinking about. So the subject that's preoccupying me at the moment, I've put under the title of The Value of Bodies Out of Place. Let's see if I can make this work. Yeah. Okay. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, nowadays people think of asylum seekers, exiles, and captives, which are some of the categories I think Lene also mentioned, as being out of place. And I'm using out of place differently than displaced because sometimes people are not displaced and can still be out of place of rights, protection, and belonging. And the reason we think of them as being out of place is because we do live in the world of nation states and physical borders. But what happens in antiquity prior to that time? What happens when we don't have what Hannah Arendt referred to as the trinity of state, people, and territory? So to understand what happens, this is where the ancient world matters, is we really have to expand what it means to be out of place from where we're starting off in the 21st century. Since social relations defined geographic space differently than today, the capacity to access those rights of protection and belonging was rarely determined by the location of one's body in space. So there were no regional scale maps, if you like, on which the boundaries of such kind of territories could even be drawn. So maps to scale did not exist at this period in the ancient world. Not that all the tools were there to make them, but there wasn't just an interest in the same way. So what I'm interested in is how people who are out of place become entangled in interstate competition for power, its acquisition and expression. So this is taking forward, Lene, what you started off with, right? So that it matters who it is and how people are used. And that's really what I focus on there. So who benefits and benefited from people's out-of-place situation and how? And I'm just going to give you 3 examples that I'm focusing on, and I'll focus a little bit more detail on one of them. So asylum seekers, for example, challenge a potential host to assert their sovereignty in taking them or not. People who are exiles are at times returned, while the cities are forced to take them back. Their own exiles. It sounds a bit strange, but that's one of the things Alexander the Great did, and happened a lot in the 4th century. If you're a losing state, one of the treaties could be that you have to take back your exiles. So emplacement as a tool, as a weapon, using exiled people that way. Also captives. Something appears particularly in later history, late antiquity. Ransomers were very keen to have captives that could be ransomed, especially bishops, because that could help increase their jurisdiction. So that's what I mean by weaponizing and instrumentalizing people who are out of place. But what I'm also interested in is very much this interdependence and reciprocity between those who are in place, if you'd like, those with effective citizenships and positions of power, and others who are excluded, who are out of the place of those rights and protection. So for the next remaining 5 minutes, I'm going to focus on that very first case, the asylum requests. And asylum requests and negotiations are considered by some, especially Zeitlin, as one of the earliest forms of international relations. So again, when I commented on Lene's paper, one of the things I finished with is this notion of exceptionality. Right? So if people who are out of place are part of international relations, instantly they have to be part of the system and not something outside it. So I just want you to keep that in mind as I go through. So my starting point is what you see on this slide, which is the classical Greek world of city-states, at one of its really crucial junctures in the 5th century BC with the experimenting with the polis democracy. And this was a transition which ancient authors explored through a discourse of appeals for refuge and supplication. So the ancient authors show a deep interest in how authorities, in exercising their power, struggle to balance the responsibility and obligation to the people, their own people, the demos, the asylum seekers, and the gods. So if you want to understand democracy and how it might work, what you do is almost take a case study, and that case study is what happens in negotiations about asylum seekers. And this is incredibly well exemplified in Aeschylus's tragedy, The Suppliant Women. The image you see here is of a production of The Suppliant Women, and this is the chorus of the Danaids, the protagonists of the play, who are the 50 daughters of Danaus who are fleeing from a forced marriage from Egypt. It was performed in 2017, and it was performed using local young women from South London as part of the main chorus at the Young Vic, and this is an adaptation by David Grieg. The play was very first time staged in the 460s BC, at the very moment of polis democracy's instigation. And it's centered on that emphatic appeal for refuge, which the mythical Danaids make to the Argive king on their flight from Egypt. As the play opens, what we find is these women on the shores of a liminal space between the sea and the city, and they cling to the altars of a sanctuary, and from there, under the gaze of the protective gods, they supplicate Pelasgos, the king of Argos. In their appeal, they recognize and invoke the sovereign into being, if you'd like. I'll come back to what I mean by that. And the king's reply, interestingly, instead of addressing their plea, instead focuses on who is being invoked. Okay. He says, this is the king, "You are not sitting at the hearth of my house. If the city as a whole is threatened with pollution, it must be the concern of the people as a whole to work out a cure." So this comes back to your referendum point that you were making. It's got to be the people who decide what happens. So is it the king or the people who have the capacity for sovereign action? Which of them is the host? This comes back to the point about responsibility. Who carries the ultimate responsibility for the safety of the suppliants in the eyes of the gods? The king's response is greeted with a very forceful reply from the women, which I think in today's day and age, because we do not have face-to-face contact, and the authorities don't have a face-to-face contact with people asking for refuge, it's all done through this huge haze and buffer of applications and paperwork. You don't hear the very powerful voice of these women, who says, "You are the city, I tell you, you are the people, a head of state not subject to judgment." As the play progresses, the Danaids are made to realize that their appeal, made from the sanctuary of the public shrines, has positioned them not as suppliants of an individual, the king, but the Argive state and the polis. And here we have to have intermediaries, which also Lene mentioned, so these people who you have to have a sponsor now as well. So we should just note very quickly that the king's jurisdiction was not defined by territorial extent. Territory does come into play in this world in articulating sovereign entities to a certain extent, but not really sovereign entities around states in this ancient context. Land and space mattered, but in very different ways. And I'm not going to focus on that here, but I'm happy to take that in questions. So the challenge for the hosting polis, for providing adequate refuge for suppliants, especially big groups, was that it did not bring with it the hostility of opposing states. As in other words, so if they're fleeing from Egypt, they didn't want Egypt to make war on Argos, which is exactly what happens in the play because they take in the Danaids. So the intermediary between the suppliants and the host is the god, invoked as protector from the side of the shrine and altar, which guarantees protection. So the request for refuge establishes a relationship between the asylum seeker, the host, and also that higher power, which we have expressed in the gods, which interestingly in some ways is very similar to today's United Nations. On the one hand, this is the ultimate high power. On the other hand, there are very few tools that these high powers have to hold authorities to account. So the seekers of refuge, I'm just going to see what I've got to next. Yeah. So the seekers of refuge make visible, if you'd like, the skin or the membrane of the hosting entity and its jurisdiction by, first of all, pointing to the presence of those who are positioned external to it, and also by appealing to the host's power of protection and their ability to make autonomous decisions, whether to provide hospitality or not, without outside pressure. So if you like, the suppliant's request acts as a catalyst for the practice of sovereignty and becomes a form of recognition of that sovereignty through deference of the potential host as a sovereign. So that is, I should say that the word sovereign is actually a 17th century concept. In the ancient context of Greece, it would be referred to as freedom, eleutheria, autonomy, autonomia, and power, dynasteia, or dunamai. So sovereignty is in many ways a negotiation of social relationships within a meshwork, I would say, of interdependence. And that existed beyond and in spite of territorially defined sovereign entities even today. And this will be maybe exemplified in my very last case, which I'm going to refer to, which is that of a small Indonesian community, a fishing community of Aceh. And this refers to their response to requests for refuge by the Rohingya, who were stranded in a boat in the Andaman Sea. The Aceh fishing village community rescued the Rohingya and took them in despite the deliberate inaction by national and the international community, and despite the threats from their own state authorities should they respond. Their actions saved lives and afforded reprieve in the short term, so coming back to this point of the short term. And this prompted a national and an international response to provide further aid. The fishermen justified their action by drawing on the culture of rescue prescribed by the customary maritime law, which is here Hukum Adat La'at. Breaching that code of conduct would put all seafarers at risk, including the fishermen themselves. And any of you following the RNLI response over the last couple of years to boats, they said the same thing. Actually, the law of the sea means we have to rescue people, and we will not be guided by political institutions in this case. One of the things that the Aceh fishermen could do is imagine themselves in that position where they would be the ones who were needing to be rescued. And they would be the ones who would be needing refuge. So this is about the arrogance I spoke of before of contemporary states. So their fishermen refused to be bound by state law to the extent that it represented an unacceptable compromise of maritime law, and something they referred to as Pamulia Jamais, which is the customary law of respecting guests and welcoming strangers. If this is read through the Derrida lens, as McNevin and Misbach, who were the ones who presented this case, in their case, the state law represented an unacceptable compromise of the law of hospitality. The request for refuge, which came to the Aceh by the Rohingya, allowed these fishermen to recognize themselves as the host, not the state, which was inactive. Their autonomous sovereign action, driven by customary laws, widened the meaning of interdependence beyond that of individual states. It focused on the open reciprocity of trust that also binds across time and into the future. So to conclude, the appeals and negotiations I've briefly introduced here are a way of understanding how displaced groups and individuals have a key role within sovereign discourse. Those citizen strangers, the stateless, or people with non-effective citizenship whose existence lies seemingly beyond the possibilities of sovereign action. Their engagement with potential hosts and states does more than expose the workings of sovereignty. It also reveals those that are displaced as agents bearing the tools of its articulation. So encounters with people who are deemed on the outside or in between, at the same time materialize, destabilize boundaries of community and the notions of the sovereign, and also reveal internal friction and power dynamics. So as such, they have been through time also instrumentalized by ruling powers to constrain autonomy of others and extend their own authority and jurisdiction. Asylum negotiations reveal an interdependence between one who is expelled and the other who is incorporated. So there is therefore an urgency to reposition people out of place, not as outside of the norm or the system, but within it and part of its making, especially in light of the proportion of those who have experienced being out of place, which makes it difficult to be considered a condition that is exceptional. Thank you very much for your attention.
Before I thank, I think it's a brilliant talk. To invite anybody in the audience to put questions or observations. I can't see. I'm glad to see. Anybody want to ask me this question?
I just wanted to ask how you, obviously in the first section there were comparisons between Ukraine and displacement in general, and then the second obviously there's the example of the fishery village and stuff. I wonder how you saw the host for Ukraine scheme and what place you saw that in the host relationship as well as the comparison of displacement in the past.
Is that for you or me?
I think it's all you can start off.
But I need, my hearing is not very good. Can you just phrase the last bit?
That's right. I just wondered how you saw the Homes for Ukraine scheme that obviously the government put in place now, and how you saw that in the context of obviously when citizens, the referendums, etc. in the past, citizens made the open doors, and I just wondered how you saw that fitting in.
Well, the organised invitation for people to go to the homes is something that obviously becomes necessary to move the restrictions on who can actually fly out and one of the things that are the extensive neighborhood responsibility goes out in the middle. If you look at the Asian world, which is what is that what you're thinking of here? I mean, the adults have one particular rule, and probably others do as well. But if you can't go to wish for those things, you probably have some kind of table with costume specialists now. How exactly is that? This is something that you don't get the details of, but there's quite a lot of work we've done on the methods of And the sponsor was willing to take you on, and you could arrange to have the family members there, then that was it, as long as the domestic tax was there. And that, of course, is very different from the way that the Ukrainians do it now. And indeed also the way that, I mean, I don't remember, of course, the ins and outs of the war. Like that in 1968, but where all these officials were coming across the Baltic, it was my impression that there was a willingness to get people in and then find the sponsors. It wasn't state organized that way, but once they were in the families, then they were eventually given the right to stay. Does that make sense?
I'm just going to add one tiny thing to this. I mean, what's interesting is in the Ukraine home scheme, as you say, it's a state-organized thing, but in 2015 and since then, there have been individuals who want to host and are not allowed to host.
Yeah.
So that's what makes the Ukrainian Homes for Ukraine scheme at least a bit easier for people who want to host. But that idea of people wanting to host individuals the way they might have done in the ancient world is definitely something, that's the problem, is the state stops the hosting. So in the case of the Danaids, supposedly, this is a mythical play, what happens is they become, I think they're our first example of people who actually get metic status in the ancient world.
And he's the first documented.
The first documented one, which is really exciting, right? And they are taken into the homes, and then there's a really interesting passage in the play itself about the whole process of whose homes are being taken into and how they're going to be protected and so on. So clearly this probably reflects legal texts and other kind of policy documents that would have been done. And I mean, it would have been wonderful to see the bigger context of that. But yeah, thank you very much. You just made me think of that. Thank you for your question. I think somebody was somebody.
Yeah, thank you very much for this lecture. It's absolutely fascinating. A couple of the slides that you showed mentioned fear and stress. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, do we have any sources that talk about kind of individual people's experiences of the incredible stress that it must be to live as a displaced person?
Well, we have some, and of course we also have descriptions of people with symptoms that some people now recognize or at least are giving up with traumatic stress disorder. I think that it's very difficult, just as it is now, to work out where people's mental health is affected primarily by their being displaced and uncertainty on that, or whether it's about something of experience. I mean, the graphic scheme is about the destruction of cities. That would be complicated. And I think it's very difficult. I think it's out of place to imagine that people back then didn't get traumatized seeing their loved ones killed, their houses burned down, their children killed in front of their eyes, their daughters raped. It must have been absolutely horrible. As I say, the PTSD symptoms, of course, are described mainly in relation to prominent individuals who get written up in historiographical accounts or in worship. But probably this would have been the case for an awful lot of the people who are witnesses. And what it does to people in terms of their ability to cope is another question. And here I wonder whether some of the second generation people, refugees, may respond not with, as it were, empathy and willingness to pass on what they have received from others, but actually go the other way because simply the memory is too hard. That's why I wish that I could have shown that documentary, because some of the people who recognize themselves, or in one instance, a man who was basically getting out of a person, are absolutely, reactions so different. Someone said, I don't want to talk about anything. I can talk about that day, but I don't want to talk about the moment before. Others are actually opening up. And again, we are talking about people. We're not talking about figures. We're talking about different individual responses.
And of course, what we have are exilic writings, lots of exilic writings. But what's interesting there is that whether we call it trauma or anything else, the longing and the pain comes from not being able to return to that one place. The issue today is that you have people stuck in what might be called, there's a whole book on permanent temporariness by Sandy Halal and Alessandro Petty, if anybody's interested, and I think it's available online, open access. But it's that inability to go anywhere and to arrive nowhere, and that's a very different kind of way of being. So it's almost, and some of these places, like in refugee camps, are basically open-air prisons where they can't even leave the camp. You have to get a permit to leave the camp. So I think there's definitely pain and displacement, but everybody, as Lene says, everybody's individual, and depending on what your journey is through that, your experience as an individual. Maybe we could talk in the reception about that if you're really interested more about that, otherwise I don't want these other questions.
But surely, apart from being individual, there is the common humanity that joins. And in this case, perhaps you could tell us more about the sacred aspect of, especially of the asylum keeper, the unwritten law that has to be respected, as in the modern period, very beautifully illustrated also.
Well, I'm more cynical when it comes to the Greeks' respect for all the divine. I think that that's one of the reasons why it's so problematic and tragic. For every instance where people are professing their piety, there's another one where subjects are ripped away from the altar, where people are somehow tricked out of the protection of the divine. There are instances also, and that's where, of course, you mentioned that thing about weaponizing, as it were, people from the outside. There are actually, I'm afraid, demonization of outsiders in Greek rhetoric. And also the kind of displacement, fear kind of thing whipped up with these people coming in hordes and basically displacing us. I'm afraid that's already hypothesis. So again, it's very much a question of how you construct the other, and you can, in a sense, talk people into being common human beings to whom you owe an obligation, and the gods of course also on the side. And then you can have the other one, where they say nothing to do with us. In the auditors, again, Europeans who basically are faced with should we accept something or not, and then find ways basically to throw them out. And where there's the priest who goes around basically knocking down swallows from Apollo's temple and basically saying that this is the kind of interpreting the oracle this way is actually wrong, and then of course the curse comes from afterwards. But the fact is that this is kind of staged as well as a possible response to that. Say nothing to do with us, go away, we don't want you here. Otherwise, the Suffolk women, of course, would not be drowned because they have no choice.
And I think, to what Lene is saying, we have interestingly horrible things that happen to communities like tidal waves, earthquakes, are often traced back to mistreating of suppliants. So one thing you might say, oh, well, see, there you respect the gods, but you might also say, despite knowing this, they're obviously refusing or killing suppliants and dragging them away from the shrines and the temples. So that's what when I said was, well, I'm not sure that they were any more hospitable than anyone else or than we are necessarily today, but the arguments were differently made. So presenting oneself as hospitable, even if one really wasn't, or finding these kind of loopholes to not honor either what the gods would like or what the United Nations want, like Australia has made the whole of their outer coast not Australia for the purposes of people landing by boat. So you don't have an automatic right to claim asylum if you land by boat around Australia, because technically it's not. And a bunch of anarchists thought, okay, we're going to take this seriously and going to stake a claim to that bit of land, which supposedly is not Australian, to make the point. You can't have it both ways. But there are these loopholes already looked for in the ancient world, and also in the contemporary world, who look like they're honoring either the gods or the United Nations protocols, but in reality they're not. So.
Right, just a last question.
I was quite interested in when you referred to second generation family members of immigrants having taught in London, where there was a lot
second, third generation children of different ethnic groups. And I just wondered how, do we have any evidence of second and third generations of people that did settle in Athens? You know, how did they settle into communities there? You know, as their generations passed.
We have, and one of the, again, this is one of the things I wanted to take up and really discuss with you further. One thing that is very important to know is that if you don't require citizenship, and that's the sort of social that really is required. But if you don't, in a second half of this administration force, there's one thing you are, and that's owning land. You can be a tenant farmer, but you can't farm land. And that's actually one of the things that connect people to a place in an agrarian society, which is quite different from what we're doing now. So even the third generation, unless they have been given either special privilege of being Alston land, or acquire land, or inherit land, or outright citizenship, they will actually be in a marginal position in terms of not being part of those who own the land. And I think that's important. And one of the comparative examples that I mentioned in one of my articles is actually that of Greece after the eviction of Jews from China, where those, it was a report in terms of the United Nations report, one of the refugee volunteers was looking at a very different way of responding to displacement by those who had urban occupations, even people who were professional in laundry or secretaries, clerks, whatever. And they were actually standing on the ones who really were physically and mentally distressed were the farmers. And that, of course, then it was spun into another displacement story where they were given plots of land in Macedonia from where Turkish people had been evicted. So you get this sort of tragedy played out there. But it was the response to farmers, I think, is one of the things that bind people together, and that is one of the things we know if it rapidly, not just the lands, but countless of communities. All second, third, second, see, land ownership was for those who were born citizens who belonged or who had been given us. So that in the third generation, they actually still ended up being marginalized in that.
And also just to keep in mind that Athens, it seems like the majority of the population were actually metics. So this kind of strategy was a huge proportion of the people in Athens were not themselves citizens, and who'd lived there sometimes for generations. Yeah. So this is what some of the epigraphic evidence and other things are suggesting. At least a very large proportion. There might be a debate whether it's a majority or not. But also Plato's dialogue takes place in the house of a metic to think about citizenship, community, and politics, and that's not accidental. So that relationship between those who Lene just described, who have that connection, and the others of the city who may not, I think that's where that interdependence, that relationship, I think, can really be played out.
Before Chris uses a final word, I'd like to offer a vote of thanks and a small anecdote. About 4 years ago, we had a meeting. About 4 years ago, we had a meeting, and we asked, what do we do? What do we do in classes? What do we do in humanities? And one of the things we do is we engage with issues. We engage with things that matter. We engage with contemporary problems, because that's what we think about. And when we decided we would invite Elena for this talk, we knew this was going to be political, because it's all around. And that was a key element of why we invited her, apart from our admiration for her archaeological and historical work. First class, international important, engaged humanities work. And that fits with what we want to say about how and why we study the classical world. What we didn't know is that the government would try to pass through a bill on migration, illegal migration as it seems to call it, just before the lecture was timetabled. The Home Secretary would describe migrants as invaders. The Home Secretary would talk about those people who are coming as not having British values. And what are the British values? This is clearly an attempt to divide them from us. This is an act of sovereignty, to decide that they are not us, and that we, whoever we are different. And one of the values of history is that we actually can see waves of people moving about. We can see that empires have moved individuals all over the world. In British history, there have been waves of migrants, and to talk about only the most recent ones, from the Huguenots, from the Jews who fled the Spanish Inquisition, to the waves of Jews that came in the 19th century fleeing Russian and Central European persecution, to the Huguenots who came fleeing persecution in France, to the Dutch settlers, to the Europeans who have come to make a living in the UK, to the West Indian population who came with Windrush, to the displaced South Asian populations who came in the 1960s or came before, to the wave of Europeans who came with the EU, so many of whom are in this room today. All these waves of migrants, all these waves of persons have enriched our culture over centuries. My family's been here already for years and years and years, as far as you can tell. The artificial way in which territory and nation creates divisions, creates a concept which is British values, has never been more obvious. There's a national story that is told which tries to make sovereignty at the centre of human relations. But I think what we've seen today in both talks is a counter to that which is extremely powerful. And it's a counter to that which makes us think about every individual person who's come to another country, come to another city, who has moved, who has decided to make a new life for whatever reason. People who've been forced out for a whole range of circumstances, economic, cultural, political, religious. People who've just come to make a better life. And the way in which those people then engage with others and build communities. That's the first slide that we were shown. Behind every face, behind every number, behind every person in a refugee camp, there is a story. There is an individual. And if there's anything that humanities as a research project should do across our 4 schools, across our many, many disciplines, is to make us face the individuality of those people. To recognize those people not by their nation, not by their sets of cultural values, although those are honoured, but to recognize them as humans and to see ourselves in them. That is one of the core aspects of what we do in the classics department, is recognize the other, engage with the other, value the other in that distant past. But it's also what we do as humanities, what we do as humans, what is so crucial what makes it so crucial that we educate our children in the humanities and educate our children to respect and value other people. This has been a brilliant series of talks. And this is a crucial research, two different research projects which are related, which shows why humanities and the ancient world should be studied. Thank you very much for affirming our faith again in academic study. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lene and Lena, for this wonderful, wonderful and complementary set of reflections and these brilliant talks. Okay, now, last but not least, we decided, colleagues in the department realized that in recent years, students are faced with increased pressures, financial pressures, and especially, this was the last couple of years, the first time that students could not register for modules that involve trips to Greece or Rome because of the cost that those trips incur. They can't afford it, they say, and therefore they couldn't take a module. And this, broke our hearts, but also made us think of ways to support them, to redress this issue. And we decided to launch the Amanda Claridge Fund. Amanda was a dear colleague, a prominent professor of Roman archaeology who wrote, as many of you will know, the archaeological guide to the city of Rome. She led trips to Rome as part of the City of Rome module, undergraduate module, third year undergraduate module. And sadly, she left us. She passed away in May last year, 5th of May 2022. So we decided to launch this fund, the Amanda Claridge Fund, that seeks to help students who require financial aid to take part in trips to archaeological sites or places of historical interest that relate to trips, or to take part in archaeological placements or excavations outside the UK, which are part of their undergraduate degree. So now, if we do really well in this fundraising campaign, we hope to use some of the surplus funds to fund scholarships for students who have accepted offers for postgraduate courses in the department. So this is the QR code which links to the Donate website on the Royal Holloway, the webpage on the Royal Holloway website. We'll send it through as well via email. Think about it. This is the first time we're trying something like this, and let's hope it works out. Let's hope that we're surprised by the generosity of friends and alumni, former students, and so on. So this is the start, and we hope that this goes well. So this is in honor of Amanda. So thank you all for coming. Please go out to the foyer where drinks and nibbles will be served, and feel free to ask our speakers more follow-up questions. Approach one another. There will be badges with names so that you get to know more people, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you so much.